1 week. That's all it took for the world security map to start bending in ways people once considered impossible. 7 days ago, U.S. forces carried out an operation in Venezuela that ended with Nicolas Maduro in American custody, an act that instantly raised alarms about legality, escalation, and precedent. 6 days ago, the White House publicly refused to take military force off the table as a pathway to Greenland, territory governed within the Kingdom of Denmark, a U.S. ally inside NATO. 5 days ago, Denmark's Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen said something that no leader should ever have to say inside the world's most powerful military alliance. If the United States move militarily against another NATO country, everything stops, including NATO security guarantee. Read that again. A NATO ally is publicly discussing a scenario where the United States becomes a threat. This isn't theory. It isn't a think tank tabletop exercise. It's unfolding live, through official statements, escalating language, and the kind of strategic ambiguity that can turn a diplomatic crisis into a security crisis. And when Stephen Miller was asked whether force would be ruled out, the answer wasn't reassurance. The message was closer to inevitability, that nobody would fight the U.S. over Greenland's future. That line matters, not because of the plan, but because of the mindset. The idea that the absence of resistance makes the action acceptable. So here's what this analysis is going to do, step by step, without hype. What Greenland is, why Trump keeps pushing it, what Denmark is doing in response, how Republicans are reacting, and why this dispute now threatens the stability of the most successful alliance in modern history. Start with the basics, because the basics are the trap. Greenland is the largest island on Earth, sitting between North America and Europe, with much of its territory above the Arctic Circle. It has a population around 57,000, smaller than many U.S. towns, and most residents are Inuit/Greenlandic indigenous people. Greenland is not an independent country. It is a self-governing territory within the Kingdom of Denmark, with wide authority over domestic affairs under the 2009 self-government framework, while Denmark retains responsibility for defense and foreign policy. And the United States is not absent from Greenland today. The U.S. already operates Patuxent Space Base, formerly Thule Air Base, under a long-standing defense arrangement with Denmark. It's a strategic site for Arctic surveillance and early warning. So the obvious question isn't, why does Greenland matter? Greenland clearly matters. The real question is, why does Washington need to own it, if it already has access and presence? That question is exactly where the official argument starts to wobble. The public justification. Security, Russia, China. Trump's public framing has leaned on a blunt claim. If the U.S. doesn't secure Greenland, Russia or China will. But analysts point out the gap between the threat description and the proposed solution. The U.S. already has operational access and a major base presence. The U.S. that Denmark Defense Framework already supports American security requirements. In other words, the security case explains why Greenland is important, but it does not clearly explain why annexation or coercion is necessary. And when the case doesn't fully add up, the motive tends to migrate. The second justification, rare earth minerals. The next argument is the one that sounds modern, strategic, and technologically urgent, rare earths. Greenland has significant mineral potential, and Europe has identified many critical raw materials that exist there. The geopolitical context is real. China dominates rare earth processing and refining capacity globally, which makes Western governments sensitive to supply risk. But the leap from minerals exist to military pressure makes sense, collapses under practical realities. Mining in Greenland is expensive, slow, infrastructure limited, and politically constrained. Projects can take years, often decades, before meaningful output is produced. So even if minerals are part of the story, they don't neatly justify an urgent coercive posture that risks detonating NATO. Which leaves the most uncomfortable explanation. The motive might be simpler. fixation, dominance, and legacy. Trump pursued the idea of acquiring Greenland back in 2019, and Denmark publicly dismissed it. The story didn't end. It fossilized. Now the rhetoric has returned, but with an added layer. The administration's posture is no longer purchase talk. It's options talk, including force. And the timing matters. After Venezuela, he wouldn't actually do it, stop sounding like analysis, and start sounding like denial. The week that changed the temperature. Multiple outlets report that U.S. forces captured Maduro during an incursion in Caracas and transferred him to the U.S. for prosecution. An extraordinary escalation with major international law implications. Shortly afterward, the Greenland issue moved from speculative to explicit. Reuters reported White House messaging that the U.S. military is always an option in discussions about acquiring Greenland. Denmark's prime minister responded with the strongest warning imaginable, essentially stating that a U.S. attack on a NATO country would end the post-World War II security structure as we know it. And European reactions have signaled alignment with Denmark and Greenland's right to self-determination. This is how alliances break. Not with one explosion, but with a sequence of statements that removes the shared assumption that we would never do that to each other. Denmark isn't only talking. Denmark is preparing. Denmark has announced major Arctic defense investments, including capabilities tied to Greenland and the North Atlantic. Moves described as among the most significant defense buildups in modern Danish policy. That is the nightmare scenario for NATO, a member state building up not just because of Russia, but because of fear that the alliance's anchor might become unpredictable. Why this threatens NATO at the structural level. NATO's Central Promise, Article 5, is built on one foundational assumption. The United States is the ultimate backstop, not a potential aggressor. Article 5 has only been invoked once, after September 11th, when allies, including Denmark, joined U.S.-led operations. So when Denmark's leadership suggests that a U.S. move against a NATO ally would end everything, it's not rhetorical drama. It's a recognition that NATO cannot function if members must plan for the possibility of coercion from inside the alliance. Republicans are openly pushing back, rare and revealing. What makes this moment stand out is how many Republicans have criticized the idea of coercion or force against Greenland, some using unusually harsh language. And that matters because it signals internal tension. Lawmakers try to draw a line without triggering full-scale war with their own party's leader. But talk is not the same as constraint. Reports indicate lawmakers are considering measures that would restrict funding for any military action targeting Greenland, because Congress can't stop rhetoric, but it can try to choke off capability. That sets up the real test. Does Congress actually enforce guardrails when the target is an ally? Greenlanders themselves are not a prop, and they've been clear. Polling and reporting from multiple outlets indicate strong opposition in Greenland to becoming part of the United States, with many viewing Trump's interest as threatening. At the same time, many Greenlanders favor eventual independence from Denmark, but on their own timeline, through their own democratic process, not through outside pressure. That distinction is the moral core of the crisis. Sovereignty isn't just lines on a map. It's consent. The wider shockwave is already visible. If the U.S. even appears willing to coerce a NATO ally, European defense planners start recalculating immediately about deterrence, procurement integration, and strategic autonomy. And the propaganda consequences are enormous. Rivals get handed a narrative that the rules-based order is conditional, even among democracies. The bottom line, this crisis isn't about an island. It's about whether the post-1945 alliance system can survive a scenario where the United States signals that force against allies is not unthinkable. The Danish Prime Minister's warning wasn't melodrama. It was a line drawn at the edge of the abyss. If the U.S. moves militarily against another NATO country, the alliance and the security structure built around it stops. And after Venezuela, Reassurance based on he wouldn't go that far is no longer reassurance. It's just hope. So the question isn't whether this is dangerous. The question is whether anyone with formal power, Congress, allies, institutions, can still enforce limits before words become actions.